Hey everyone, this is Mary Beth McAndrews from Dread Central, and I am here today with Kiah Roache-Turner, the director and co-writer of the new film Wyrmwood Apocalypse. Hello, how are you?
Hello, Mary Beth, and anybody else who's watching and listening. It's great to be here.
This movie is an absolute blast, and it is a sequel to the first Wyrmwood film. Did you go into making the first film knowing you were going to make a sequel, or with a plan to make a sequel?
Oh, 100%. I mean, this was our first film and we were trying to make a splashy movie. And so immediately you just go, well, what can we make that we could possibly do? Like, I don't want to say franchisable because it's kind of a dirty word and it's unclassy, but it is true. We were trying to make something that we could make more of. And so, we're like, well, let's make a kind of Star Wars-y Raiders of the Lost Ark-y kind of thing, or a, Dawn of the Dead-y kind of thing. And so that's what we did. And this was always meant to be a trilogy. And so, yeah, hopefully if this one does well, even if it does just as well as the first one, like we'll get to make the third one and that'd be great because we get to close the loop and like really finish off the trilogy in a way that is like really full on. And it's great because the third one, we were thinking of what's going to happen in the third one even like 10 years ago. So we've been thinking about this for like over 10 years. And so it sort of answers all the questions that you have. And in a way, it would write us into a corner, and there's nothing better for a writer than to be written into a corner. So I'm just like, how the hell can we make more? Like, there's no way to make more once we make the third one. And I'm really looking forward to that because then I'll have to think of all new awesome things to be able to continue, if we can, into a TV series or whatever. So with this world and with this premise and concept, it's endlessly riffable for me. Like, I could make this stuff for the rest of my life as long as people will let me,
Yeah. So when you were a kid, like when you were growing up, were you a big fan of like practical effects and splatter, gory horror movies? Like, were those the kind of movies you were into growing up?
Yeah, and they're all the best, man. Like what is better? Like, you tell me, like, what's better than Alien, The Thing, and The Exorcist?
Literally nothing. Like The Thing.
Nothing. Like, it does. Like, you show me one digital monster that's better than any of that practical stuff. Like even Jaws. Like, there's some clunky shots in Jaws, but man, like just the practicalness of seeing that thing rise out of the depths. Like, the shots that work are phenomenal. Like, the shots that don't, let's not talk about it. But just nothing beats a practical monster in an actual location. Like, there's just something about the way that it interacts with the light, the way that it interacts with the actor. You can't get that same effect digitally. And like, there's something in that uncanny valley that makes it less scary. If just a small, tiny part of your brain knows that it's an animation, it's not scary because there's no actual threat. Like, there's just a tiny part of your brain screaming, not real. But if it's an actual object in the room interacting with the shadows, or an actual object under the water in the Jaws thing, or like an actual object and you can see in The Thing, like there's liquid running down the prosthetics in a way that means that those prosthetics are real. There's something in your brain that screams real. It's real. I know it's not real, but it's moving and it seems alive. And to me, practical effects in horror films are absolutely paramount, because the classic example for me is I Am Legend. They're all those vampires are kind of digital, and none of them are scary. Like, it's an action film. And it's such a pity too, because I was looking at the practical tests that they did for those, and I was like, oh, that looked great. Shoot that, do that. And they made the decision to go digital. And it was such a pity because I actually quite like that film. It's quite a good film. But, the digital decision was like a very bad one because it robbed it of the possibility of being a really decent horror film. And it just turned it into a digital action film. And to me, if you don't have practical effects in your horror film, like, you're putting yourself on the back foot and you've got a very, very uphill battle, but like, even in action, even in an action context, like I believe that to me, it should be 80% practical and 20% digital augmentation. Nothing should be created digital from the ground up. It should be digital augmentation only. Digital is a tool with which you paint reality into your frame. Like, you should be using reality as the base from which you create films. And that's something that all the great filmmakers working today believe in, whether it's Christopher Nolan or Tarantino or Denis Villeneuve. Like, they all use practical as a base. Whereas the other filmmakers who I won't name, who use digital as a base, are far less successful, in my opinion.
Yeah. Well, and speaking of practical effects, I mean, incredible practical effects and creatures in your film. And so, curious, what was the most difficult moment to create with practical effects in this film? Because there's a lot of them.
That's a hard one. I mean, probably the obvious one is the cyborg zombie.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a guy in a suit with a very, very heavy wooden, like, claw arm. I thought it was going to be plastic, but it came in and they're like, no, we had to make it out of wood for various reasons. So it was really heavy. He's in just layers and layers and layers of prosthetics. And he's in a set that is about as big as a rich person's bathroom. We're crammed in there. We have to turn the air conditioning off, like, while we're shooting because of noise. Yeah. So it's hot as hell. It's probably 36 degrees in the set because we're shooting in Australia, which is a hot country. We've got probably 20 crew in masks because, we're shooting in a pandemic. So everybody's wearing masks, everybody's sweating like buggery. We've got 20 people crammed into a tiny room, and we're asking him to throw a stunt person through a wall. And he can't see very well. So he's going, where is she? Okay, I'll lift her up. 1, 2, 3, boom, let's do it again. And not only that, the action of the cyborg zombie moment was actually intercutting between action that's occurring in 2 other separate rooms. And so we weren't just dealing with all the physical difficulty of, doing, this big bad sort of action sequence where she's fighting, a giant cyborg zombie. We've also got to keep the continuity of 3 separate pieces of continuously cross-cutting action correct. And we're shooting all of those pieces of action on separate days in separate weeks because of the way that, film sets are scheduled. So that was a very full-on couple of days, yeah.
Wow. And that scene that you're talking about is incredibly choreographed. Like, every horrible thing that happens to every person there is incredible and terrible. And I was just wondering what it's like to choreograph a giant action sequence like that and to kind of plan where each person is going to get what type of injury. I just think it's so interesting how that's all choreographed and put together.
Well, the way I look at it is it must be like how somebody, like Beethoven, or so. I'm not saying I'm like Beethoven, but I'm far from that. But like, I would imagine that when somebody who's writing a symphony is doing their big third act, where it's like, okay, the cymbals need to be doing this, and then in come the piccolos, and then the oboe does that, and then the bass section, and then the percussion. So you've got to keep all that stuff in your head. You've got all these different departments doing different things, but all at the same time and all building to the same climax. And so the tricky thing was that you've got a room where, like, a hybrid zombie Supergirl is fighting a giant cyborg zombie. And in order for that cross-cutting to work, what was happening in the other 2 rooms had to be just as interesting as that room. And so every time you cut away from the cyborg zombie fight, you don't want the audience going, whoa, why are we cutting away from that? It's super interesting. So you have to be cutting to something that's as interesting, and then cutting back to something that is super interesting, and then cutting back to the cyborg. So it all has to work in harmony and build to this giant climax, where each piece of action in the room is building to a climax at the same time, moving towards something where you have 3 climaxes occur at the same time. That needs to be aesthetically pleasing, but also you need to have this big boom and then quiet time. And everybody needs to feel that each room has been finished off correctly. And when you're cutting that madness, it's so hard to find that balance. And the only way to do that is to write it very, very specifically, storyboard it very, very specifically, but also you have to be able to hold it in your head. because even with storyboards, half the time the crew's like, I don't understand how this cuts. Like, how does this work? And you just have to say, trust me, I see it in my head and it works in my head. And then you get into the cutting room and, then you basically just, assemble what's in your head on the timeline. And sometimes you're right and sometimes you're wrong. And if you're wrong, you've got to fix it. But usually the good thing is, one of the great things about having a semi-photographic memory like I've got is like I just know it works because I've already shot the whole thing in my head, and I storyboard my own stuff, so I know it's going to work and it's fine, and it almost always does. So yeah, but it's it's just like visual symphony.
That's a really cool way to describe it. And speaking of another part of the visuals, the costume design and the set design are absolutely incredible. It's like from the armor they wear to the weapons that they're carrying. And I just wanted to hear more about kind of what inspired the aesthetic and what it was like creating this kind of apocalyptic cyberpunky aesthetic.
Thank you for saying just those two particular departments are just like, I mean, there's an epic story behind every department on this because we had no money and we were reaching for the stars. So you're trying to get people to do, 50 times what they can do on the budget that they have. And the costume in particular was difficult. We went through a bunch of different costume designers where they'd come in, they'd look at the budget, they'd look at what we want and just go, can I swear on this? Yeah. How the fuck am I going to do this? And we couldn't afford to hear that, so we kept looking for somebody who'd come in and just go say the right words. And Tracy Rose Spark, who did our costume, she's been in the business for 20-30 years. She's done heaps of war films, so she's used to doing lots of costuming on a small budget, and she came in and just went, when do I start? Like, I'm so excited. And I'm like, oh, thank you for saying those words. That's what I needed to hear. And she did such a good job with all the costumes. Our production designer, Esther Rosenberg, she's very young and she'd never done the production design on a film before. She's been, again, in the business for long enough and done enough films to have a professional grounding. And she's brilliant and a complete artistic genius, but she'd never been head of department. And so there were big questions when I decided that I wanted this untried production designer to do this film, this is a film that lives or dies on the way it looks. And so if we cast incorrectly in that department, we were in a lot of trouble. So there were, our co-producer was definitely like, hey, I don't think this is, are you sure? And I'm like, sometimes as a director, you just have to lay yourself on the line and you have to just go, look, I'm 100% sure I have a feeling about this person. And I was right. And I love being right, because she came in and, she came in 3 months before pre-production even and just started building. She went out there and she's just got such an ability to get her hands dirty and such an ability to just push, beyond what anybody else would do. I mean, part of that is being young and hungry, but the other part is just, we just lucked out and got an artist who was just ready. And, when you get a young person, sometimes it can stuff up because they haven't done it before. But the other thing that can happen is you get somebody who's just at the start line, ready, like a bull at a gate, and all you have to do is open that gate. And she just went in and she created a world that was amazing. Because to me, I look at that and I think back on all my influences, like the 2000 AD comic books and stuff, and she's created something that sits just beautifully in any post-apocalyptic cinematic aesthetic or comic book aesthetic or graphic novel aesthetic that you've seen. She really did everything right. And we were very lucky to have both of those departments working at such a high level on such a small budget.
Yeah, absolutely incredible. And then I also just want to point out the score, just shout out the score. Your score as well. It was incredible balance of kind of almost over the top, but matching the tone in a really incredible way. So all of those elements just came together incredibly well in this film and made it quite an amazing experience, I will say.
Yeah, I've been working with Michael Lira, our composer, I think since about 2012, I think, so almost 10 years now. He's scored all my films and all my shorts. And yeah, he does that for us very well, where that is exactly the tone we're going for, is almost over the top, but not with serious undertones and with an underlining sense of humor to it. But also a very clear idea that, hey, when it needs to be scary, this is a horror, and he's very good at that. So he can shift between serious and sort of over the top classic genre and comedy very seamlessly. He's an incredibly talented musician. Yeah.
And so, okay, I'm a huge fan of Australian horror movies. I'm curious if there are any must-see Australian horror films that you think more people need to watch?
I mean, I'm a fan of the ones that everybody else is a fan of. The Babadook and Wolf Creek, obviously. But, there's fun ones like Peter Weir's first film. I mean, it's almost a comedy. He did The Cars That Ate Paris. That's a weird one. That's one to look out for. I don't know. Not really. Just really Babadook and like Wolf Creek are my favorite Australian horror films. And they fell really well into the mainstream market. And I think they're as good as they can be in that genre. And I would hope that like Wyrmwood, even though it's like low budget, I'm hoping that it's as good as you can hope for with a post-apocalyptic horror comedy. And I look at Wolf Creek and that's as good as you get with a slasher film. Like really that can sit with any other slasher film. Like you put Wolf Creek next to Halloween, it's fine. Same with Babadook. Like Babadook as just a monster horror, as a psychological monster horror. You put Babadook and The Exorcist on a double bill, the Babadook isn't going to be embarrassed. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And that's what you want. You want something that can sit up there, as an Aussie, because I'm a proud Aussie, I'm like, I want our films to be as good as everybody else's. And, I love the fact that those two films in particular are as good as you can get for what they are. And I know that both of them were made on such a low budget, and yet the directing and the craft of them is just beautiful. So they're the ones I like.
Cool. Then I just have one last question for you, and it would be, speaking of double bills, if you could double bill Wyrmwood Apocalypse with any film, what would you double bill it with?
Well, it'd be either Mad Max 1 or Dawn of the Dead, but I think it's better with Dawn of the Dead. And I'm not talking about the Zack Snyder remake, I'm talking about the original George A. Romero.
Okay.
I think that would be really fun.
Cool.
So actually, okay, so if I could put Wyrmwood 1 with anything, it'd be Dawn of the Dead. If I could put Wyrmwood Apocalypse with anything, I actually would screen it with Road Warrior. I think that would be fun. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Ooh, that would be fun.
Yeah.
Well, Kiah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. Wyrmwood Apocalypse is out now. Everyone check it out. And thank you so much again.
Thank you, Mary Beth. And yeah, anybody who's listening or watching this, go out and watch it, because the more of you who watch it, the more likely it is I get to write Wyrmwood 3. And I want to write Wyrmwood 3. I want to make that tomorrow, man. I got so many mad ideas for it. I'm excited to make it. So go out and watch this film so I get to give you another one.
Yay, go watch it.